thought I'd try something a little different. I'm going to try to read from a book, specifically to help people fall asleep. So I'm going to put just part of the story up here for now as an experiment. So listen to it and let me know if it's something that you could fall asleep to. And if enough people like it, I'll put the whole story up there. What I'm going to be reading this time is something out of the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And I'm just going to try to do it very softly and not a lot of voices or really differences in my tone. Just try to keep it soft and gentle and something that hopefully you can relax to or fall asleep to. Okay, so the story is going to be The Red-Headed League from Sherlock Holmes. I had called upon my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, one day in the autumn of last year, and found him in deep conversation with a very stout, florid-faced, elderly gentleman with fiery red hair. With an apology for my intrusion, I was about to withdraw when Holmes pulled me abruptly into the room and closed the door behind me. "You could not possibly have come at a better time, my dear Watson," he said cordially. "I was afraid you were engaged." "I am very much so." "Then I can wait in the next room." "Not at all. This gentleman, Mr. Wilson, has been my partner and helper in many of the most successful cases. I have no doubt that he will be of the utmost use to me and yours also." The stout gentleman half rose from his chair and gave a bob of greeting, with a quick little questioning glance from his small, fat, encircled eyes. "Try the settee," said Holmes, relapsing into his armchair and putting his fingertips together, as was his custom when in judicial moods. "I know, my dear Watson, that you share my love of all that is bizarre and outside the conventions and humdrum routine of everyday life. You have shown your relish for it by the enthusiasm which has prompted you to chronicle, and, if you will excuse my saying so, somewhat to embellish so many of my own little adventures. Your cases have indeed been of great interest to me, I observed. You will remember that I remarked the other day, just before we went into the very simple problem presented by Miss Mary Sutherland, that for strange effects and extraordinary combination we must go to life itself, which is always far more daring than any effort of the imagination. A proposition which I took the liberty of doubting. You did, Doctor, but none the less you must come round to my view, for otherwise I shall keep piling fact upon you, until your reasons break down under them and acknowledge me to be right. Now, Mr. Jabez Wilson here has been good enough to call upon me this morning and to begin a narrative which promises to be one of the most singular which I have listened to for some time. You may have heard me remark that the strangest and most unique things are very often connected not only with the larger, but with the smaller crimes, and occasionally, indeed, where there is room for doubt whether any positive crime has been committed at all. As far as I have heard, it is impossible for me to say whether the present case is an instance of crime or not, but the course of events is certainly among the most singular which I have listened to. Perhaps, Mr. Wilson, you would have the great kindness to recommence your narrative. I ask you not merely because my friend Dr. Watson has not heard the opening part, but also because the peculiar nature of the story makes me anxious to have every possible detail from your lips. As a rule, when I have heard some slight indication of the course of events, I am able to guide myself by the thousands of other similar cases which occur to my memory. In the present instance, I am forced to admit the facts are, to the best of my belief, unique. The portly client puffed out his chest with an appearance of some little pride, and pulled a dirty and wrinkled newspaper from the inside pocket of his greatcoat. As he glanced down the advertisement column, with his head thrust forward and the paper flattened out upon his knee, I took a good look at the man, and endeavored, after the fashion of my companion, to read the indications which might be presented by his dress or appearance. I did not gain very much, however, by my inspection. Our visitor bore every mark of being an average commonplace British tradesman, obese, pompous, and slow, and he wore rather baggy grey shepherd's check trousers and not overly clean black frock coat, unbuttoned in the front, and a drab waistcoat with a heavy brassy Albert chain. and a square bit of metal dangling down as an ornament. A frayed top hat and a faded brown overcoat with a wrinkled velvet collar lay upon the chair beside him. Altogether, look as I would, there was nothing remarkable about the man save his blazing red hair, and the expression of extreme chagrin and discontent upon his features. Sherlock Holmes' quick eye took in my occupation, and shook his head with a smile as he noticed my questioning glances. Beyond the obvious facts that he has sometime done manual labor, that he takes snuff, that he is a Freemason, and that he has been to China, and that he has done a considerable amount of writing lately, I can deduce nothing else. Mr. Jabez Wilson, starting up from his chair with a forefinger upon the paper, but with his eyes upon my companion. "How, in the name of good fortune, did you know all of that, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. "How did you know, for example, that I did manual labor? It is true as a gospel, and I begin as a ship's carpenter." "Your hands, my dear sir. Your right hand is quite a size larger than your left. You have worked with it, and the muscles are more developed." "Well, then, the snuff, then, and the Freemasonry." "I will not insult your intelligence by telling you how I read that, especially as, rather against the strict rules of your order, you use an arc and compass breastpin." "Ah, of course, I forgot that. But the writing?" "What else can be indicated by the right cuff so very shiny for 5 inches, and left one with a smooth patch near the elbow where you rested upon the desk?" "Well, but China." "With the fish which you have tattooed immediately above your right wrist could only have been done in China. I have made a small study of tattoo marks, and have even contributed to the literature of the subject. That trick of staining the fish's scales with a delicate pink is quite peculiar to China. When, in addition, I see a Chinese coin hanging upon your watch chain, the matter becomes even more simple." Mr. Jabez Wilson laughed heavily. "Well, I never," he said. "I thought at first that you had done something clever, but I see that it was nothing in it after all." "I begin to think, Watson," said Holmes, "that I make a mistake in explaining. Omne ignotum pro magnifico, you know. My poor little reputation, such as it is, won't suffer shipwreck if I am so candid. Can you not find the advertisement, Mr. Wilson?" "Yes, I have it now," he answered, with his thick red finger planted halfway down the column. "Here it is. This is what began it all. You just read it for yourself, sir." I took the paper from him and read as follows: "To the Red-Headed League. On account of the bequest of the late Ezekiah Hopkins of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, USA, there is now another vacancy open which entitles a member of the League to a salary of £4 a week for purely nominal services. All red-headed men who are sound in body and mind and above the age of 21 years are eligible. Apply in person on Monday at 7 o'clock to Duncan Ross at the official offices of the League, 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street." "What on earth does this mean?" I ejaculated after I had twice read it over, the extraordinary announcement. Holmes chuckled, and wriggled in his chair as was his habit in high spirits. "It's a little off the beaten track, isn't it?" he said. "And now, Mr. Wilson, if you will go at scratch and tell all about yourself, your household, and the effects which this advertisement had upon your fortunes. You will first make a note, Doctor, of the paper and the date." "It is the Morning Chronicle of April 27, 1890. Just 2 months ago." "Very good. Now, Mr. Wilson?" "Well, it is just that I have been telling you, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Jabez Wilson, mopping his forehead. "I have a little pawnbroker's business in Colbrook Square near the city. It is not a very large affair, and of late years it has not done more than just give me a living. I used to be able to keep 2 assistants, but now I only keep 1, and I would have a job to pay him, but that he is willing to come for half wages, and to learn the business." "What is the name of this obliging youth?" said Sherlock Holmes. "His name is Vincent Spaulding, and he is not such a youth, either. It's hard to say his age. I should not wish a smarter assistant, Mr. Holmes, and I know very well that he could better himself and earn twice what I am giving him. But after all, if he is satisfied, why should I put ideas into his head?" "Why, indeed? You seem most fortunate to have an employee who comes under the full market price. It is not a common experience among employers in this age. I do not know what your assistant is not as remarkable as your advertisement." "Oh, he has his faults too," said Mr. Wilson. "Never was such a fellow for photography, snapping away with a camera when he ought to be improving his mind, and then diving down into the cellar like a rabbit into a hole to develop his pictures. That is his main fault, but on the whole he is a good worker. There is no vice in him." "Is he still with you, I presume?" "Yes, sir. He and a girl of 14 who does a bit of simple cooking, and even keeps the place clean." That is all that I have in the house, for I am a widower, and never had any family. We live very quietly, sir, the three of us, and we keep a roof over our heads and pay our debts, if we do nothing more. The first thing that put us out was this advertisement. Spaulding, he came down into the office just this day 8 weeks with the very paper in his hand, and he says, "I wish to the Lord, Mr. Wilson, that I was a red-headed man." "Why is that?" I asked. "Why," he says, "here's another vacancy in the League of Red-Headed Men. It's worthy quite little fortune to any man who gets it. As I understand it, there are more vacancies than there are men, so that the trustees are at their wits' end as what to do with the money. If my hair would only change color, there's a nice little crib all ready for me to step into." "Why, what is that then?" I asked. "You see, Mr. Holmes, I am a very stay-at-home man, and as my business came to me instead of me having to go to it, I was often weeks on end without putting my foot over the doormat. In that way I don't know much about what's going on outside, and I'm always glad to get a bit of news." "Have you never heard of the League of the Red-Headed Men?" he asked with his eyes open. "Never." "Why, I wonder at that, as for you are eligible yourself for one of the vacancies." "And what are they worth?" I asked. "Oh, merely a couple of hundred a year, but the work is slight, and it need not interfere with your other occupations." Well, you can easily think that this made me prick up my ears, for the business had not been over good for some years, and the extra couple of hundred would have been very handy. "Tell me about it," I said. "Well," he said, showing me the advertisement, "you can see for yourself that the League has a vacancy, and that there is the address where you should apply for particulars. As far as I can make out, the League was founded by an American millionaire, Hezekiah Hopkins, who was very peculiar in his ways. He was himself a redhead, and he had a great sympathy for all red-headed men. So when he died, it was found that he had left his enormous fortune to the hands of trustees, with instructions to apply the interest to providing for easy berths to men whose hair was of that color. From all that I hear, it is splendid pay, and very little to do." "But," I said, "there would be millions of red-headed men who would apply." "Not as many as you might think," he answered. "You see, it is really confined to Londoners and to grown men. The American had started it from London when he was young, and he wanted to do the old town a good turn. And again, I have heard it is no use your applying if your hair is light red, or dark red, or anything but real, bright, blazing, fiery red. Now, if you cared to apply, Mr. Wilson, you would just walk in, but perhaps it would hardly be worth your while to put yourself out in that way for the sake of a few £100. Now, it is a fact, gentlemen, as you may see for yourself, that my hair is of a very full and rich tint, so that it seems to me that, if there was to be any competition in the matter, I stood a good chance as any that I had ever met." Vincent Spaulding seemed to know so much about it that I thought he might prove useful, so I just ordered him to put up the shutters for the day, and to come right away with me. He was very willing to have holidays, so we shut the business up and started off to the address that was given to us in the advertisement. I never hoped to see such a sight as that again, Mr. Holmes. From north, south, east, and west, every man who had a shade of red in his hair had tramped into the city to answer the advertisement. Fleet Street was choked with red-headed folk, and Pope's Court looked like a coster's orange barrow. I should not have thought that there were so many in the whole country as were brought together by that single advertisement. Every shade of the color there were: straw, lemon, orange, brick, Irish setter, liver, clay. But, as Spaulding said, there were not many who had the real vivid flame-colored tint. When I saw how many were waiting, I would have given up in despair, but Spaulding would not hear of it. How he did it I could not imagine, but he pushed and pulled and buttoned up till he got through the crowd, and right up to the steps which led to the office. There was a double stream up on the stairs, some going up in hope, and some coming back down dejected, but we wedged as well as we could, and soon found ourselves in the office. "Your experience has been a most entertaining one," remarked Holmes, as his client paused and refreshed his memory with a huge pinch of snuff. "Pray continue your very interesting statement." There was nothing in the office but a couple of wooden chairs and a deal table, behind which sat a small man with a head that was even redder than mine, and he said a few words to each candidate as they came up, and he was always managed to find some fault in them which would disqualify them. Getting a vacancy did not seem to be much of a very easy matter at all. However, when our term came, the little man was more favorable to me than any of the others, and he closed the door as we entered, so that we might have a private word with us. "This is Mr. Jabez Wilson," said my assistant, "and he is willing to fill out the vacancy for the League." "And he is admirably suited for it," the other answered. He has every requirement. I cannot recall if I have ever seen anything so fine." He took a step backwards, cocked his head to one side, and gazed at my hair until I felt quite bashful. Then suddenly he plunged forward, wrung my hand, and congratulated me warmly on my success. "It would be unjust to hesitate," he said. "You will, however, I am sure, excuse me for taking an obvious precaution." With that he seized my hair in both hands and tugged until I yelled with pain. "There is water in your eyes," he said as he released me. "I perceive that it is all as it should be, but we have to be careful, for we have twice been deceived by wigs, and once by paint. I could tell you tales of cobbler's wax which would disgust you with human nature." He stepped over to the window and shouted through at the top of his voice that the vacancy was filled. A groan of disappointment came up from below, and the folks all dropped away in different directions, until there was not a single redhead to be seen except for my own and that of the manager. "My name," he said, "is Mr. Duncan Ross, and I am myself one of the pensioners upon which this fund left our noble benefactor. Are you a married man, Mr. Wilson? Have you a family?" I answered that I had not. His face fell immediately. "Dear me," he said gravely, "that is very serious indeed. I am sorry to hear you say that. The fund was, of course, for the propagation and spread of the redheads as well as for their maintenance. It is exceedingly unfortunate that you should be a bachelor." My face lengthened at this, Mr. Holmes, for I thought that I was not to have the vacancy after all. But after thinking it over for a few minutes, he said that it would be all right. In the case of another, he said, the objection might be fatal, but we must stretch a point of favor for a man with such a head of hair as yours. When shall you be able to enter upon your new duties? "Well, it is a little awkward, for I have a business already," I said. "Oh, never mind about that, Mr. Wilson," said Vincent Spaulding. "I shall be able to look after it for you." "What would be the hours?" I asked. 10 to 2. Now, a pawnbroker's business is done mostly in the evening, Mr. Holmes, especially Thursday and Friday evening, which is just before payday, so it would suit me very well to earn a little in the morning. Besides, I know that my assistant was a good man, and that he would see to anything that turned up. "That would suit me very well," I said. "And the pay?" "It is £4 a week." "And the work?" "It's purely nominal." "What do you call purely nominal?" "Well, you have to be in the office, or at least in the building, the whole time. If you leave, you forfeit your whole pension forever. The will is very clear upon that point. You don't comply with the conditions if you budge from the office during that time." "It's only 4 hours a day, and I should not think of leaving," I said. "No excuse will avail," said Mr. Duncan Ross. "Neither sickness, nor business, nor anything else. There you must stay, or lose your billet." "And the work?" "It is to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica. There is the first volume of it in that press. You must find your own ink, pens, and blotting paper, but we provide the table and chair. Will you be ready tomorrow?" "Certainly," I answered. "Then goodbye, Mr. Jabez Wilson, and let me congratulate you once more on the important position with which you have been fortunate enough to gain." He bowed me out of the room, and I went home with my assistant, hardly knowing what to say or do. I was so pleased with my good fortune. Well, I thought over the matter all day, and by evening I was in low spirits again, for I had quite persuaded myself that the whole affair must be some great hoax or fraud, though what its object might be I could not imagine. It seemed altogether past belief that anyone could make such a will, or that it would pay such a sum for doing something so simple as copying out the Encyclopedia Britannica. Vincent Spaulding did what he could to cheer me up, but by bedtime I had reasoned myself out of the whole thing. However, in the morning I determined to have a look at it anyhow, and so I brought a penny bottle of ink, and with a quill pen and 7 sheets of foolscap paper, I started off for Pope's Court. Well, to my surprise and delight, everything was as right as possible. The table was set out ready for me, and Mr. Duncan Ross was there to see that I got fairly to work. He started me off upon the letter A, and then he left me, but he would drop in from time to time to see that I was all right. At 2 o'clock he bade me good day, complimented me upon the amount of that I had written, and locked the door of the office after me. This went on day after day, Mr. Holmes, and on Saturday the manager came in and planked down 4 golden sovereigns for my week's work. It was the same next week, and the same the week after. Every morning I was there at 10, and every afternoon I left at 2. By degrees, Mr. Duncan Ross took to coming in only once of a morning, and then, after a time, he did not come in at all. Still, of course, I never dared to leave the room for an instant, for I was not sure when he might come, and the billet was such a good one, and it suited me so well, that I could not risk the loss of it. 8 weeks passed away like this, and I had written about habits, and archery, and armor, and architecture, and Attica, and hoped with diligence that I might get to the bees before long. It It cost me something in foolscap, but I had pretty nearly filled a shelf with my writings when suddenly the whole business came to an end. To an end? Yes, sir. And no later than this morning. I went to my work as usual at 10 o'clock, but the door was shut and locked. There was a little square of cardboard hammered into the middle of the pane with a tack. Here it is, and you can read it for yourself. He held up a piece of white cardboard about the size of the sheet of notepaper. It read in this fashion: The Red-Headed League is dissolved October 9th, 1890. Sherlock Holmes and I surveyed this curt announcement and the rueful face behind it, until the comical side of the affair so completely overtopped every other consideration that we both burst out in a roar of laughter. I cannot see that there is anything very funny, cried our client, flushing up to the roots of his flaming head. If you can do nothing better than laugh at me, I can go elsewhere. No, no, cried Holmes, shoving him back into the chair from which he had half risen. I really wouldn't miss this case for the world. It's so refreshingly unusual, but there is, if you will excuse me saying so, something just a little funny about it. Pray, what steps did you take when you found out the card upon the door? I was staggered, sir. I did not know what to do. Then I called for the offices round, but none of them seemed to know anything about it. Finally, I went to the landlord, who is an accountant living on the ground floor, and I asked him if he could tell me what had become of the Red-Headed League. He said that he never heard of such a body. Then I asked him who Mr. Duncan Ross was. He answered that that name was new to him. Well, I said, the gentleman at number 4. What, the red-headed man? Yes. Oh, he said, his name is William Morris. He was a solicitor, and was used by my room as a temporary convenience until his